In 1938, a kindergarten teacher named Helen Hulick walked into a Los Angeles courtroom to testify in a burglary case. She was wearing slacks. The judge refused to let her speak, sent her home to change, and when she came back in trousers again, held her in contempt and put her in a jail cell for 5 days. She told reporters exactly why she'd done it. "I'll come back in slacks," she said, "and if he puts me in jail, I hope it will help to free women forever of anti-slackism." It was not an isolated case. In one place, a woman needed police permission to wear trousers in public, a rule not formally repealed until 2013. In another, women were prosecuted under a public morality law for wearing trousers, and that law was not repealed until 2019. None of that was really about clothing. It was about who gets to move, who gets to work, who gets to ride, and who has to ask permission first. And the strangest part is this: the object at the center of all of it was never built with men in mind at all. So who actually decided this was a men's garment? A tailor? A king? A church? None of them. The first solution came from someone thinking about a horse. The rule that came later had almost nothing to do with the invention itself. The assumption is that trousers began as menswear, and everyone else adopted them afterward. The evidence points somewhere else. Trousers did not begin as fashion or as a rule about who could wear what. They solved a mechanical problem: how to sit on a moving animal without the clothing fighting the rider. Before trousers existed, most of the ancient world dressed the same lower body in one of a few shapes: a robe, a tunic, a wrap, or a length of cloth draped and pinned. This was not a failed attempt at something better. It suited the life people were living. Picture actually wearing one: a single rectangle of wool or linen wrapped around the body and belted at the waist, left loose enough to move air across the skin in the heat of a Mediterranean afternoon. No seams to chafe, no tight cuffs to trap sweat. Walking to a market, working a flat field, standing for hours in a public forum. The robe did all of it without complaint, and it did it using a fraction of the labor a tailored garment would demand. An ancient loom produced one long, flat sheet. No cutting the fabric into leg-shaped pieces, no fitting each seam to a particular body, and almost no scraps wasted on the floor. Clothing also told people who you were: the drape of your robe, the whiteness of your wool, the folds pinned at your shoulder. All of it told strangers your rank before you spoke a word. For a life spent almost entirely on foot, this was close to a perfect solution. But a perfect solution only stays perfect as long as the job stays the same. And somewhere on the grasslands east of the Caspian Sea, the job was about to change completely. Now put that same robe on a horse. The fabric bunches at the hip on the first stride. It rides up on the second. By the third, it's sliding under you at exactly the moment your balance depends on staying still. The horse does not care about your silhouette. Around 3,300 to 3,000 years ago, in what's now Western China, a community at a site called Yanghai depended on horses for nearly everything: herding animals across open ground, hunting at speed, and riding into combat. This was a daily mechanical failure, repeated every time someone swung a leg over a horse's back: chafed thighs, torn seams, a rider who had to choose, every ride, between modesty and grip. The answer was not a better robe, it was a different garment. Archaeologists excavating burials at Yanghai found the oldest known trousers yet discovered: 3 separately woven wool panels, one for each leg, joined by a diamond-shaped crotch insert that let the legs spread without tearing the cloth at the seam. This garment wasn't cut from finished fabric. It was shaped directly on the loom to one rider's exact measurements, using a twill weave, diagonal interlacing that gave rigid wool a stretch flat weaving could never manage, with the knees reinforced by hand-twined patterns thick enough to survive years in a saddle. This was tailoring in one of its earliest recognizable forms, engineered for a task, not for appearance. The people buried in these trousers were buried with the tools of that task: a bow, a bridle, a battle axe. The garment sat in the same category as the weapon beside it: equipment. The detail that changes the picture is this: riding, herding, and mounted warfare on the steppe were not tasks reserved for men. Evidence from Scythian burial sites suggests many female graves included weapons and riding equipment alongside the dead. Women armed and mounted the same way the men beside them were. Ancient Greek artists, observing these horse cultures from a safe distance, painted trousered women warriors on their pottery, the root of the Amazon legend. Some of that story is myth, but a story like that usually has something behind it. So the mystery is not the invention, it is what happened next, in one particular part of the world. The garment travels outward from the steppe into Persia, carved into the stone reliefs at Persepolis. When it reaches Greece and Rome directly, it acquires a different label, not male, but foreign. Roman writers called it brachae and treated it as the clothing of savages. Cicero argued publicly that wearing it was proof of a people's lawlessness and lack of moral character. To Rome, the important category was never gender, it was insider versus outsider. But cold weather made the argument hard to maintain. As the empire pushed into the freezing frontiers of Germany and Britain, Roman soldiers discovered that a breezy linen tunic offered zero protection against a northern winter and adopted snug woolen feminalia. Just to survive the season, the habit filtered back through returning veterans into ordinary civilian life. By the late 4th century, trousers were everywhere inside the empire, and Roman elites panicked. Emperors Honorius and Arcadius banned trousers inside the city of Rome itself, on penalty of losing all your property and being sent into permanent exile. 13 years later, Visigoth forces, wearing trousers, sacked the city. The foreign framing dies with the empire that invented it, but the garment's exile from Western respectability is not over. It's about to go underground and take several centuries to resurface as something else entirely: a rule. By the early Middle Ages, trousers had gone from a banned public garment to something worn but never shown. Men wore loose linen underdrawers called brazies, with separate stockings, hosen, laced individually to the waistband underneath a long outer robe. Nobody saw them. Nobody was meant to. Then, over generations, court fashion did something strange. Hemlines started rising. Men's outer robes and jackets grew shorter, decade after decade, exposing more of the hose underneath. What had been strictly private was becoming, gradually and then unavoidably, on display. The two separate stockings were joined into single hose to cover the gap, and because the fabric had no stretch, a small triangular flap had to be added at the crotch, just so the wearer could move. That small flap changed the social meaning of the garment. A private undergarment had become a public one. Hidden clothing does not get legislated. Visible clothing does. By the mid-1500s, that functional flap had become the codpiece, padded, jeweled, and deliberately shaped to draw the eye. Henry VIII wore them in battle armor. Merchants used them as pockets for loose coin. What began as a solution to an open seam had become a conspicuous symbol of masculinity in Western clothing. Trousers were no longer simply a garment men wore, they were performing manhood in public. By the 1700s, Western families had formalized the display into ritual. A boy's first pair of trousers, handed over in a small ceremony called breeching, marked the moment infancy officially ended. Girls stayed in skirts for life. The rule had moved beyond fashion. It was now a rite of passage, with gender written directly into it. Then politics did the rest. Under the French monarchy, silk knee breeches marked the aristocracy, and long trousers marked the laboring poor. When revolution broke out, the poor's trousers became a badge of loyalty, and the aristocrats' breeches became a death sentence. The revolutionaries even named themselves after it, the sans culotte, those without knee breeches. By the early 1800s, the long trouser had won completely, becoming the uniform of the modern gentleman. And in 1800, Paris took roughly 7 centuries of accumulated custom and turned it into law. A woman wishing to wear trousers in public first needed police permission. What took 700 years to build culturally became, in one ordinance, a legal fact, and for the first time, the rule had teeth. The permit system was not a formality. Painter Rosa Bonheur had to renew hers every 6 months just to walk through a cattle market without being arrested. When the bloomer costume appeared in the 1850s, women wearing it were chased through streets and mocked in newspapers. By the 1890s, a 15-pound skirt was a genuine hazard on a bicycle, and Paris quietly amended its own law, twice, in 1892 and 1909, to permit trousers specifically for anyone holding a bicycle handlebar or the reins of a horse. Riding. The exact activity that started this entire story 3,000 years earlier is the one thing the law could not argue against. In 1899, Lady Florence Harberton was refused service in a hotel coffee room for wearing cycling knickerbockers. She sued and lost, but the trial made the fight public. Then, in 1938, came Helen Hulick, jailed 5 days for testifying in slacks. Her contempt order was eventually overturned on appeal. Then 2 world wars did in a few years what a century of argument had not. As men left factories for the front, governments recruited women into industrial labor where a skirt was impractical and dangerous. Trousers and overalls became standard issue almost overnight. But the permission was conditional. When the war ended, many of those same women were quietly moved out of the jobs that had required them. The clothing stayed. The authority it had briefly signaled did not. Society had used the trousers without agreeing to the argument underneath them. The legal record moved more slowly and not at the same pace everywhere. By the 1930s, trousers on women photographed as glamour, not scandal. Dietrich in a tuxedo, Hepburn rarely seen without them. In 1966, Yves Saint Laurent put a women's tuxedo on the runway and called it Le Smoking. Culturally, the argument was already over. Legally, it wasn't. The U.S. Senate didn't lift its own dress code ban on women's trousers until 1993, after 2 senators simply wore pantsuits onto the floor. The 1800 Paris Ordinance wasn't formally struck down until 2013. Laws like these reached beyond fashion. In Sudan, a public morality provision was used to prosecute women for wearing trousers, responsible for tens of thousands of cases in a single year, according to rights groups, a law not repealed until 2019. The culture had already moved on. In some places, the law took another 200 years to notice. In others, it hadn't noticed at all until this decade. So, were trousers ever made exclusively for men? No, they were made for riders. Men were simply the group one part of the world chose to keep the rule for, long after the original reason for the garment had stopped being about gender at all. This was never a rule about which bodies could wear cloth divided at the legs. It was a rule about who was allowed to move freely, work without restriction, ride without permission, and carry authority in public. And for most of this object's 3,000-year history, that included everyone. The phrase, "who wears the trousers," used as shorthand for domestic authority, only makes sense if trousers were male property from the start. They were not. A modern pair of riding jodhpurs is, in cut and construction, close to identical to the trousers buried at Yanghai 3,000 years ago. The object never disappeared. It was buried under centuries of rules that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with control. Because trousers are only half the story. And once you see clothing that way, the next question gets stranger. Why did the most powerful kings and cavalry officers in the world spend centuries walking around in high heels? And how did the shoe end up exclusively in women's closets instead? But that is a story for next time.